Mandate for Leadership 2025, better known as Project 2025. This is an almost 900-page book that contains all of the policy recommendations for the next conservative president. And it's something that contains recommendations, some of which are pretty chill and kind of like, oh yeah, whatevs. Like mostly maybe anybody might agree with that. And some of them are ones that even people who are very conservative are like, no, that's too far. I don't agree with that, right? There's this whole range of things. So in this video, rather than dig into all of the policy recommendations that this document makes, I want to talk about 5 underlying assumptions and principles that the people who wrote this document carried into it and how these things informed their thinking. Because these 5 things are the actual most important issues that you need to get right in your head and you need to understand in your own head and your own heart in order to then really figure out what we should be doing next with policy, right? Because a fundamental thing that you need to understand is if you misdefine the problem, then you misapply the solution. So if the problem isn't what you defined it as, then no solution that you come up with is going to work properly. And if it does, it's just going to be a completely random thing, right? So we have to define the problem. So this video is going to be about the 5 major problems that the Mandate for Leadership Project 2025 authors are addressing. Issue number 1, the deep state is real, it is anti-conservative, and it ignores the will of the people. This deep state is less of a giant conspiracy of, oh my gosh, like all these people who hate America and whatever. And it's this insanely expansive network of unelected bureaucrats who are very left-leaning in general and are anti-conservative and don't believe in conservative values, and that's their default. That's the way they operate, whether a conservative president is in office or not. And because of that, when a conservative president is elected, these people, the unelected bureaucrats, continue to operate in a anti-conservative way. Therefore, the deep state ignores the will of the people, because if the will of the people was to move towards more conservative values, and that's why they elected a conservative president, then these group of unelected officials are working against the will of the people, and that's bad, and that's wrong, and that's a complete and utter failure of government. That is the first assertion of the document, and it's the first and major problem that the authors are trying to address. And so what you need to ask yourself is, do you think that that's real? Do you think that there is a huge bevy of unelected government officials who are not responsible to the people? And if the will of the people is to move more in a conservative direction, if that group of unelected officials are not moving in a more conservative direction and are trending in a more liberal directive, then is that bad? Is that a problem? Because if you don't think that that's a problem, then you're going to disagree with everything in this document, right? But if you don't think it's a problem, allow it to challenge you and ask yourself, like, why? Why isn't that a problem? Shouldn't government be to serve the will of the people? What is the will of the people? How do you define it, right? Dig into these questions, right? But the first assumption and the first assertion of this document is that the deep state is real, it is anti-conservative, and it ignores the will of the people when a conservative president has been elected to office. Okay. The second assertion of this document and the second problem that it's trying to fix is woke ideologies, specifically DEI, gender ideology, and climate change. Those are the 3 they talk about all the time. And I'm just going to lump them under the term woke ideology so I don't have to keep on repeating all those things, right? They are evil and they prevent human flourishing. Okay, so the authors of this document are asserting that because they're saying that DEI is basically just reverse racism, and reverse racism is just still racism. It's the same thing, right? It's treating people different based on their skin color, right? Same thing with gender ideology. It's treating people different based on their sexuality, but even worse than that, in the expanse of the gender ideology thing, right? It's a fundamental denial of reality, and denying reality doesn't lead to human flourishing, right? And then the climate change portion of everything is kind of more on the woke end of the scale of climate change, which is this belief that humans are a parasite on the face of the planet, right? And so the idea that humans are a parasite and a net negative to the planet, and that's a bad thing, that idea is anathema to human flourishing, right? If that's the case, then we should eliminate the humans, right? And so the question that you need to ask yourself is, do you agree with that assertion? Because if you don't agree with that assertion, if you think that DEI and gender ideology and climate change concern to the point of thinking that humans are a blight on the planet, if you think that those things encourage human flourishing, you're going to disagree with everything in this whole entire document, right? So, but if you do, then just question and ask yourself why, and try to define why you think you're right and why you think someone else is wrong, right? But it's much easier and much more efficient and better for the world as a whole to deal with that underlying assumption and the underlying truth statement of these things are evil and prevent human flourishing, right? And argue whether we think that's the case or not, than it is to argue like whether we should have trans bathrooms or whether men should be allowed in women's sports and all this other stuff, right? All those other things flow out of the underlying truth assumption of, do human beings flourish under gender ideology or not, right? Because if we get that settled, then all the policy things kind of flow from that, all right? So the third truth assumption that this document makes is that abortion is murder, right? And what is coming from that, and what you need to ask yourself about that, is really, would you agree that the taking of a human life is murder? Most people would agree with that, right? So then the question becomes not this idea of, oh, is it my body, my choice, and is it this and that and the other, blah, 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 right? Everything comes down to, can you define, like all you have to do is just define when human life starts. Because if we can define when human life starts, then we can define what murder is, because murder is ending a human life. And so then if we know when it starts, then we know when it's murder or not. So instead of having all this argument about the policies and should there be a national abortion ban or should there not be, and should there blah, 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 right? All of those things flow out of, do you agree with the statement that abortion is murder or not? Which really is one level down from that is, do you agree that taking human life is murder or not? Okay, cool. Then we have to decide what human life is. And so if you disagree with that statement, again, you're going to hate everything in this document. You're going to disagree with all of it, right? Or if you agree with that, you're going to be like, yay, wee, sweet, Or you might see it and you might disagree with some of the policies because you might think like, I don't think it's the federal government's place to step in on this or that or the other, right? But it's a million times more useful to argue about the underlying ideas and the fundamental truth statements underneath the thing than it is to argue about the policies. So that's the third truth statement that they're coming at from this document, which is abortion is murder. The fourth truth idea and assumption in this document is that the role of government is primarily to facilitate and enable the solution, not to try to be the solution. Okay. If you agree with that, you'll probably agree with a lot of what these guys say. If you think that government should be the solution, if you think that the proper role of government is to be the solution, to come in to fix all these things, you're going to hate everything in this document. You're going to disagree with it, right? But you're going to argue about all these stupid policies and points and stuff without coming back to the realization of okay, let's have a conversation about, should the government's role be to fix problems or not? Or should the government's role be to enable us as individuals and as markets and as states and as all this other stuff? Should it be to enable us to fix our own problems, to clear the way and to create guardrails so that within all those, we can go in and do our own thing, right? And you need to argue that point. That point is so much more of a useful and effective point to argue and to try to come to an agreement on than just arguing about stupid policies and whether tariffs are good or bad or blah, 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 right? All those things flow out of this understanding of what is the government's proper role. And then the fifth truth assertion in this document is that the Chinese Communist Party is our number one enemy in 2024. The belief of the authors and the way that they write this whole document is that the number one existential threat that the United States faces is the rising superpower of China, specifically the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese Communist Party is anathema to the Democratic Republic that is America, right? So you have to ask yourself, do you agree with that? And if you don't agree with that, why? Do you think that those two things are fundamentally incompatible? Do you think that the way the US government was designed and created by our founders is fundamentally different than communist China? And if you do, okay, then you have to ask yourself, which one do you think is better? And if this one is better, and this one is rising up and trying to crush this one and take it out, then that's a problem. And that is the biggest existential threat that we face. And if you don't believe that, ask yourself why. Ask yourself why you think they're the same. Ask yourself why you think that this one is better than this one. Ask yourself why you're like, oh no, it's not a big deal that this government, that the Chinese government does all this and has a firewall and is blocking all this stuff and has all these fees on their citizens for all this kind of stuff and is implementing a social credit score. Like, ask yourself why you don't think that's a big deal. But again, if you come down to it and you fundamentally don't see any problem with what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, you're going to completely hate everything in every policy recommendation that comes out of this document. So again, rather than dig into all of the specific policy recommendations that they make, some of which are pretty mild and some of which are really not mild and are insanely aggressive, right? Some of which I agree with, some of which I'm like, nah, dude, I do not agree with that at all, right? Rather than dig into all those things where we get lost in the weeds of all this stuff, I wanted to bring up the underlying core beliefs and assumptions that go into making those policy recommendations, because those are the things that you need to be focusing on. Those are the things that you need to be working through in your own head and trying to figure out in your own head. Because if you disagree with those, especially if you disagree with those and you're not open to like questioning them at all, there's no point. You shouldn't watch this video. You shouldn't listen. Like, you're just going to hate everything. And you're not, the thing that I would challenge you with is that you're not interested in the truth. Right? You're not interested in trying to find the truth. You're just interested in proving to yourself that you are true and right, whether you are or not. It doesn't matter, right? So question your underlying assumptions. Question your underlying beliefs. Question the beliefs of the people that wrote those and try to understand where they're coming from and why you think they're coming from that, and then try to articulate why you agree or disagree with them, right? Because that is so much more useful than just arguing about policies when we're never going to get to any kind of a good policy agreement because we fundamentally misdefined what the problem is, right? If the assertion is that, number 2, woke ideologies are evil and prevent human flourishing, if that is actually not true, then every recommendation that these guys make that is founded upon that truth is not going to be helpful. They misdefined the problem, so they're going to misapply the solution, right? But if that is true and they correctly define the problem, then something useful can come from all of the solutions that we try to figure out, right? And we can work around and tweak the solutions and actually get to something useful because we properly defined the problem. Let me know what you think. I hope that helps. I hope it was clear. I really don't want to get lost in the weeds of all these different things because everyone that I have heard makes all these comments about, oh, this policy and that policy, and they want to destroy the Department of Education, and they want to do this and that and the other and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, yes, maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't know. Half of it's the stuff where they like either they do, either they don't. Like they said something, but who knows what it was, right? And you can go in and you can find all those things. But fundamentally, before you can decide whether those things are good or not, you have to understand the truth assumption that went into that recommendation, right? Where if we are going to take down the Department of Education and completely dismantle it, right? That comes from that truth assumption that the role of government is primarily to facilitate and enable the solution, not try to be the solution, right? And if you agree with that, then it makes sense. And if that is actually the problem, then it makes sense that we would completely disband the Department of Education because it's not the government's job to educate. It is parents' jobs to educate, right? But if that's not true, if that underlying truth assumption is wrong, then every recommendation that they have is going to be wrong because we misdefine the problem, so we misapply the solution. So it's so much more useful and so much more better in your whole life, in every situation of your life, especially in all this crazy political stuff, to make sure that you're defining the problem properly and that you understand and your reasoning for defining the problem the way that you did and that it makes sense to you. I just articulated how I think they defined the problems and what I saw in reading this whole document. And yeah, so work through those. Tell me what you think, whether you agree with them, disagree with them, doesn't matter. Work through it. Try to figure it out for yourself and make sure that you're actually trying to define the problem so that you can find an acceptable solution. Moving on. Part 3, I want to talk about just 3 kind of big takeaways that I had and surprises that I had from reading this book. It's hopefully going to be a little bit shorter, but who knows? So click right here. Check out this one. I will give you my 3 insights from reading this 900-page book.